Speaker. There is actually agreement that when the UK ceases to be a member of the EU, the EEA agreement will no longer operate in respect to the United Kingdom. As such, the government's legal position is clear. Article 127 does not need to be triggered for the agreement to cease to have effect, but we are looking at it just to make sure, for clarity purposes, that we meet it for comment.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Would my right friend agree that continued membership of the European single market, which some opposite seem now to be advocating, would negate many of the advantages of leaving the European Union while requiring us still to accept decisions which we could no longer influence? And to that extent, it actually would be worse than continued membership as a full member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The United Kingdom will no longer participate in the EEA agreement once we leave the European Union. The United Kingdom is a party to the EEA agreement in its capacity as an EU member state. So on exit day, the EEA agreement will cease to operate in respect to the UK. It will no longer have any practical relevance to the United Kingdom. We are considering what steps, if any, we might need to take to formally confirm our withdrawal from the EEA agreement as a matter of international law.
Eden Kinnock.
I thank the Secretary of State for his answer, but I'm afraid that Article 127 of the EEA agreement, to which the United Kingdom has been a signatory since 1993, clearly states that any country wishing to leave the European Economic Area must give formal notice of at least 1 year. Can the Secretary of State therefore please confirm that such notice would have to be given in order to leave the EEA, and given the fundamental constitutional, political, legal and economic importance of such a decision, that the decision to leave the EEA would be subject to a debate and vote?
Secretary of State for exiting the European Union.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is actually agreement that when the UK ceases to be a member of the EU, the EEA agreement will no longer operate in respect to the United Kingdom. As such, the government's legal position is clear. Article 127 does not need to be triggered for the agreement to cease to have effect, but we are looking at it just to make sure, for clarity purposes, that we meet it for comment.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Would my right friend agree that continued membership of the European single market, which some opposite seem now to be advocating, would negate many of the advantages of leaving the European Union while requiring us still to accept decisions which we could no longer influence? And to that extent, it actually would be worse than continued membership as a full member.
Yes, he's quite right. The simple truth is that membership of EFTA, for example, which would be one way to retain the EEA membership, would do just exactly that. It keeps us within the acquis, it would keep us within requirements for free movement, albeit with some limitations, but none of those have worked so far. So in many ways it's the worst of all outcomes. We did consider it, I gave it some considerable thought, maybe as an interim measure, but it seemed to me to be more complicated, more difficult and less beneficial than the option.
The State has given an equivocal answer on whether perhaps there might need to be a vote on the subject of the EEA. Would he at the same time consider whether we should have a vote on the settlement bill and indeed the vote on the cost of the Nissan deal set out in this rather heavily redacted letter?
Well, the heavily redacted letter wasn't from me, so I'm not entirely sure what he's referring to, but the answer generally is no.
Sir Nigel Evans.
Mr. Speaker, would the Secretary of State agree with me that we've already had a vote, and that was on June the 23rd last year? The British people decided to leave the European Union. And does he agree with me that one of the things that we can now look forward to is that we will be able to do trade deals with a number of countries throughout the world which we're now constrained from doing as being members of the European Union?
My honourable friend makes exactly the right point. We are in a position of being able to make trade deals once we leave the European Union. And that, of course, will give us enormous benefits, because as the European Union Commission itself admits, then 90% of global trade, of world trade, will be outside the EU, not within it, in the coming decades.
Yes, Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State set out his position on the EEA. On the 15th of August, the Secretary of State told the Today programme that transitional arrangements should be, and I quote, as close as possible to the current arrangements. 2 days before that, the Chancellor and the International Trade Secretary said in a joint article that Britain would leave the customs union and leave the single market. Both positions can't be right. Can you step up to the dispatch box and tell us what form of transitional arrangements the government is seeking to negotiate?
Well, I've actually already done that only a couple of days ago. I mean, just for the House, and I'll come back to the point, but for the House's interest, I'll read a small part of a Labour List article. I'll read Labour List all the time, of course. A Labour List article by the honourable gentleman who first opened this question. He said, on Sunday, Keir Starmer used an article in The Observer to call time on the ambiguity that had come to define Labour's approach to Brexit since the referendum. The ambiguity, right? It was an approach, this is the best bit, it was an approach that served us well on June the 8th. What was that ambiguity? Tell leavers you want to leave, tell remainers you want to remain. That ambiguity, of course, couldn't last, and as he said, it was never sustainable. So that's the ambiguity of the right honourable gentleman who's just been asking the question. Now, in terms of our position, it's very clear. The transition arrangements will meet the requirements, three different requirements. One is to provide time for the British government, if need be, to create new regulatory agencies and so on. The time for companies to make their arrangements to deal with new regulation, and time for foreign countries, for other countries, to make arrangements on, for example, new customs proposals. Now, that's what will be required. That's why we need to be as close as we are to our current arrangements. It does not mean that in the long run we're in either the customs union or the single market.
Plenty of material for colleagues to include in their second reading debate speeches if they so wish. The material might be better located there. Sir Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I asked the Secretary his position, and he started with my position. If he wants to swap places, any time. Given the progress to date, and knowing that we will go back to this answer, what prospects do the Secretary of State genuinely believe for bespoke transition agreements being agreed, negotiated and implemented by March 2019? And knowing how anxiously businesses are looking at this, when does he anticipate being able to tell them what the arrangements will be? Because they need to make arrangements.
Well, that's I think, a very legitimate and sensible question. The first thing to say is I believe that the benefits of a transition arrangement are both ways. They're symmetrical. They apply equally to France or Holland or Germany or Denmark as they do to us. And that's some of the readback we've been getting. I know he has been travelling around Europe himself, and he will no doubt have picked up that same readback. And we're finding that the Commission is open to discussion of transition. We've only raised it briefly at each of the last two meetings because it doesn't fit within the current four groups of negotiation. But I think there's a very good prospect.
Dr. Paul Williams.
Number two, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, the UK already goes beyond EU minimum standards in a number of employment areas, and similarly we have a long history of environmental protection. We are committed to safeguarding and improving both. The EU withdrawal bill will ensure that EU-derived workers' rights and environmental protections that currently apply will continue to be in place in domestic law on exit, and will enable those laws to continue to function effectively. It will then be for Parliament and, where appropriate, the devolved legislatures to make any future changes to EU-derived law.
Williams.
Mr. Speaker, Britain already has one of the most competition-friendly economies in the world, according to the OECD. But some members on the benches opposite want to use Brexit to dismantle workers' rights and erode environmental protections. The EU brought us...
Order. I'm sorry, but there's huge pressure of time. We haven't got time for descriptions today. What we need is short, pithy questions, preferably not heckled extensively, so we can get down the order paper. Dr. Williams.
The EU brought us parental leave for families. It brought us...
Order. I'm sorry. I explained that what I need is a single-sentence question, not a series of descriptions. Sorry. Dr. Williams.
Will the Minister assure the residents of Stockton South that their rights will not be eroded and that workers and the environment will not end up paying the price of Brexit?
Yes. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to reassure the honourable gentleman and his residents. I can reassert the government's commitment not to roll back workers' rights. The UK, as I've said, already goes beyond EU minima, and it will be for Parliament in future to determine the future course of the law.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
That's my... well, first of all, may I welcome my honourable friend to dispatch box. May I ask him to, in the course of the debates about the so-called Henry VIII powers, remind everybody that Section 2 of the 1972 European Communities Act actually gave for 40 years a British government the kind of executive authority that was never granted before, and that in leaving the European Union we will be giving Parliament back its power to scrutinise.
Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely grateful to my right honourable friend. Of course, I agree with him. What I would say to him is that I'm invigorated and excited to find that Parliament is reawakening to the need for full and proper scrutiny of secondary legislation.
Caroline Lucas.
Does he recognise the risk of an impending governance gap when it comes to environmental legislation? Because at present the Commission and the ECJ perform the vital role of both monitoring and enforcing laws. Domestic mechanisms like judicial review simply don't go far enough. So what new institutional mechanisms is he going to look at to make sure that he does leave the environment in a better state than the way he found it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for reminding the House that we are committed to leaving the environment in a better state than we found it, and she asks how we will do it. The bill makes provision for ministers to bring forward statutory instruments which will correct deficiencies which would otherwise arise as we bring EU law into UK law, and I very much look forward to the debate on the particular instruments.
Patterson.
Mr. Speaker, can I also welcome my honourable friend to the front bench and welcome his comments to the Honourable Lady for Brian Pavilion, who is completely wrong, because leaving the European Union enables us to take our full role on the international bodies such as the IPPC, the OIE, Codex Alimentarius, and we will be able to adapt the World Convention's Ramsar Bern to our own environment, our own landscape, our own fauna and our own flora. Does he agree?
Mr. Speaker, I do agree with him, and I'm most grateful to him for giving me the opportunity to put back on the record that we will uphold all our commitments to international law in relation to the environment.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the Minister's assurances a few minutes ago, Clause 9 as it stands will give the Minister the almost unlimited right, with minimal parliamentary scrutiny, to wipe out any workers' protection that they choose to do so.
That's exactly what it does.
Given that they're promising not to do that, will the government commit today to amending that clause at committee stage so that the erosion of workers' rights is explicitly excluded from the powers of that clause?
Exactly.
Mr. Speaker, the powers in the bill have been drawn widely in order that this country, this Parliament, can meet the imperative of delivering a working statute book on the day we leave the European Union, to deliver certainty, continuity and control, and on the area that the honourable gentleman raises, in order to implement the withdrawal agreement in a way that allows us to leave the European Union smoothly and successfully. So I will not give him today the assurance that he's looking for, but what I will say to him, Mr. Speaker, is that as the junior minister responsible for the bill on behalf of the Secretary of State, I will look with the utmost seriousness at the amendments that are brought forward. But what we will not do, Mr. Speaker, what we will not do is accept any amendment which compromises the fundamental purpose of the bill, which is to deliver certainty, continuity and control as we leave, and to allow us to implement the necessary changes to UK law to implement the necessary withdrawal agreement.
Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reason that the government believe Clause 9 is necessary is because of the huge volume of legislation that will have to be put through simply to tidy up potential anomalies in legislation. I'm offering them a way out. Why are they so determined to bring in legislation that they don't intend to use when they're going to have so much work cut out to bring in the legislation they do need? Why won't he commit to put into legislation the promise that he's just given to the House at the dispatch box?
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman, with respect, may be confusing clauses 7 and 9. And I think what I should say at this point is that I look forward to the fullest debate on these matters on the floor of this House when we come, I hope, Parliament willing, to committee stage.
Jenkins.
May I add my congratulations to those of my colleagues for his appointment to the front bench. It's very well deserved. Isn't the right way for the honourable gentleman for Stockton South to secure the rights of workers, to secure the environmental protections that he wants, to vote for the EU withdrawal bill? Because if the Labour Party succeeds in blocking the EU withdrawal bill, those protections will no longer exist.
Well, I'm most grateful to my honourable friend for his congratulations and, if I may say so, all his support, and I look forward to his support in future. He's absolutely right. The best way for members of this House to ensure that they serve their constituents by delivering a working statute book and the continuity of the rights and protections currently in EU law and applying to the UK is to vote for this bill and to support its passage.
Sharma. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 3, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the House will be aware, and my right honourable friend the Prime Minister has set out, our department has prioritised this strand in negotiations. We recognise the importance of providing swift reassurance to 4 million people, EU nationals living in the UK and UK nationals living in the EU. In August, we agreed to protect the rights of frontier workers, cover future social security contributions and protect existing healthcare rights and arrangements for EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in
Sharma, thank you for your answer. Business across my constituency and throughout the country are worried, not just about retaining staff, but about attracting the brightest and the best. Heathrow, just outside my seat, employs thousands. Locally and medical research firms contribute massively across the country. What can you say to assure them that Brexit won't destroy their competitiveness?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. It's an important point. We do want to make sure that as we look towards the future and we look towards a new immigration policy after we have left the European Union, we can meet the needs of business and our economy. And I'm glad that the Home Office has commissioned work from the Migration Advisory Committee to look at all sectors of the economy, look at all parts of the UK to make sure we can continue to attract the brightest and the best.
Mrs. Theresa Villiers.
Will he reiterate and emphasise the government's commitment to settling this question of EU nationals and giving them the stability they need in terms of securing their rights, including keeping families together?
Absolutely. My right honourable friend is right to raise this issue. We've set out in our paper a fair and serious offer to maximise the certainty for people, individuals and families. And it's important to remember that this applies equally to EU nationals living in the UK and many of our own nationals living across the EEA.
Paul Bromfield.
Some of the proposals the government has apparently been considering on the future EU migration may apply from the day at which we leave the European Union. Irrespective of the status of any leaked document, would the Minister agree that the government should not make any changes that would prevent them from securing a transitional deal to protect jobs and the economy?
Well, as the honourable gentleman knows, I'm not going to be commenting on any leaked documents, but of course it's important that we secure certainty and continuity for citizens in this process. The Secretary of State, my right honourable friend, has set out very clearly our commitment to establishing interim arrangements, and we look forward to discussing these issues in the context of the future partnership, which is going to be crucial to securing results on both.
Stephen Crabb.
Mr. Speaker, does my honourable friend agree that striking a positive position with respect to future migration from the EU is going to be really important, not just for the labour market, where we have skill shortages at all skill levels within the economy, but also will be one of the keys to help secure the best possible final trade deal with the EU?
My honourable friend makes a very good point, and I think it's very clear from what the Prime Minister said that even after we have left the EU, we will continue to want to seek talent from Europe. But we will continue to strike that positive attitude. But it is important that in the interests of both the UK and European citizens, we get on with these discussions, we proceed at pace and we secure a deal which provides maximum certainty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps it's given the Minister time to think about actually answering the question, which was, of course, a commitment not to introduce any new migration rules from 2019, which will impact on a transitional deal. But let me also ask, looking beyond 2019, given that the government are committed to the principle of reciprocity in any deal on citizens' rights, would he be happy for UK citizens living and working in the EU to be subject to biometric screening and fingerprinting?
Well, the honourable gentleman asked very theoretical questions about future policy, and I'm not going to get into commenting on the policy of other departments which hasn't yet been published. What I think is important here is that we negotiate in good faith to secure the best outcome for UK citizens and for EU citizens, and that is exactly what we're doing.
Nigel Huddleston.
Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we've been working closely with the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs on support for farmers. The Government will provide the same cash total in funds for farm support until the end of the Parliament. We're working closely with a range of stakeholders as well as the devolved administrations to maintain stability for farmers. The Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs will also be introducing an agriculture bill that supports our vision for a thriving and self-reliant farming sector that is more competitive, productive and profitable, to protect our precious natural environment for future generations and to deliver on the manifesto commitment to provide stability for farmers as we exit the EU.
Stern. I thank the Minister for that comprehensive response. The Minister is aware that the UK farming sector is highly reliant on EU labour. What discussions has the Minister had with DEFRA and others about the potential reintroduction of a seasonal agricultural workers scheme?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to tell my honourable friend that the Government keeps its position on seasonal workers under review. Until we've left the EU, employers in the agricultural and food processing sectors are free to continue to recruit EU workers to meet their labour needs. It remains the Government's policy not to operate migration schemes for non-EEA nationals coming to fill vacancies at lower skill levels, while employers have unrestricted access to EU labour from elsewhere in the EU. I note that the Home Office, however, told the DEFRA Select Committee earlier this year that a new source scheme could be introduced very quickly in 5 or 6 months once the need for such a scheme had been identified. And I hope my honourable friend will be reassured that we will have the agility to meet those needs.
McCarthy.
Mr. Speaker, and I hope that they are listening to the people that gave evidence to the EFRA Select Committee, evidence that the food would end up rotting in the ground if we don't have the labour force to dig it up. But can I also urge the Minister, it's not just about subsidies for farmers, it's about access to the market and tariff-free access to the market. Unless that is resolved, our farming industry will collapse.
Well, what I'd say to the honourable lady is, of course, we wish to secure tariff-free access to European markets and indeed tariff-free access to markets across the world, but these are matters for negotiation. I'm sure she would join me in saying to the European Union that it's in all of our interests to move swiftly to discussions on our future agreements.
Mr. Philip.
Farmers are amongst the most efficient in Europe. Won't Brexit give us the chance to design an agricultural policy that will be in their interest, not in the interest of inefficient farmers in Europe?
Well, he's absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. This is a unique opportunity for the United Kingdom to craft agricultural policies which suit our unique needs, and I very much hope that that will be to the benefit of the United Kingdom and our farmers.
Samuel Roberts.
Welsh farmers and fishermen need assurance now that UK and Welsh governments are working together. How often will formal ministerial discussions on agriculture and fisheries take place in the next 3 months, and will these meetings be open to formal scrutiny?
I'm very grateful to that detailed question, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to answering her in writing.
Anna Bardell.
5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, a future partnership between the UK and EU is in the interests of both sides, and I am confident that we will secure a good deal for the UK as a whole. A responsible government, however, should prepare for all potential outcomes, including the unlikely scenario in which no mutually satisfactory agreement can be reached. The Government is undertaking a comprehensive programme of analytical work to assess across a range of scenarios the economic impacts of exiting the European Union. However, and as the House has agreed twice, we will not be publishing any information which would prejudice our negotiations.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank the Minister for that answer, but the CBI President Paul Dressler said the implications of falling back onto WTO rules and a no-deal scenario would open a Pandora's box of economic consequences, and the UK could face tariffs on 90% of its EU exports by value. So can the Minister therefore reassure business that the UK will not walk away from these negotiations with no deal?
Well, what I can say to the honourable lady is that it is our intention to do what is in all of our interests, the mutual interests of all the nations of the European Union and the United Kingdom, which is to secure a deep and special partnership, including a broad and deep free trade agreement. I very much look forward to doing so. But I would say to her, I think that the World Trade Organization is one of the great achievements of liberalism against the forces of economic nationalism, and I very much look forward, under whichever circumstances we leave, the United Kingdom playing the fullest part in the improvement and development of the World Trade Organization.
I thought that the honourable gentleman was about to refer to Ludwig von Mises, but no doubt that awaits another of his answers in due course. Sir Desmond Swain.
I hope he still believes that no deal is better than a bad deal.
Well, I would agree with my honourable friend, and I would refer him to what the Chancellor famously said on Mar, that what we can't do is accept some kind of punishment deal. And I certainly think that an environment in which the United Kingdom trades with the world in the context of controlling our own tariffs, our own taxes, our own domestic regulation is an environment of which we should not be afraid.
Stephen Timms.
Mr. Speaker, does it remain the ambition of ministers to secure barrier-free access for the UK to the European single market? Isn't the reality the only way to enjoy the benefits of the single market to comply with the rules of the single market?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we recognise that the freedoms of the single market are indivisible, and the people of this country wish for Parliament to set its own laws and wish to have a UK migration policy which meets with their democratic consent. It is the ambition of ministers to secure trade which has the absolute minimum of frictions, and I very much hope and look forward to doing so.
James Cartledge.
Speaker, the question of potentially not having a deal obviously raises the issue again of a transition, and the Secretary of State said earlier he thought there was a very good prospect on that point. Is it not the case that, given that the purpose of a transition is to give certainty to business, that the only logical time frame for one is to run from when we leave until a new comprehensive deal is signed?
Well, what I'd say to my honourable friend is that the government has agreed that the country would benefit from a period of implementation, but how that period of implementation works and the destination to which we're heading still remains a matter for negotiation.
Norman Lamb.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 6 and 20 together. The Prime Minister has been clear that we will continue to cooperate with European partners on migration and asylum as we leave the European Union. In our negotiations, we will discuss the exact nature of this cooperation as part of the future partnership. As the Secretary of State said in his statement to the House on the 5th of September, we are a country with a strong tradition of tolerance and generosity, and if anything, this will grow after we leave, not diminish.
Thank the Minister for that answer. Will he guarantee that unaccompanied children who are orphaned or who have no idea where their parents are still have the right to be reunited with family members, whether they're brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, grandparents, who are living in the UK once we leave the EU? These are, after all, the most vulnerable children of all, most vulnerable to traffickers and to others who seek to abuse them.
The Honourable Gentleman is right that we should absolutely seek to continue our policy of generosity towards these children to make sure that our family reunion policy remains generous. We have and continue to reunite many refugees with their immediate family. We have granted over 23,000 family reunion visas over the last 5 years. Clearly, I can't set out the detail of what we will agree with the EU, but our intention is to agree significant cooperation in this space to make sure we can continue to bring families together.
I would call the Honourable Member for Blythe Valley if he were here, but he isn't, so I won't. But we'll hear Mr Andrew Slaughter.
Thank you, Speaker. There's a problem with Dublin 3, apart from the fact we don't implement it very well, which is that unaccompanied children have to get into the EU, often making perilous journeys, in order to apply under its provisions. So will the government therefore consider extending the provisions of Dublin 3 if we leave the EU, so that wherever you are in the world you can apply under those terms?
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman's question will have been heard. It's not really a question for this department, but it's certainly something. Our intention is to establish cooperation with the EU on these matters and to make sure that we continue to have as generous a policy of family reunion as we have to date.
Patricia Gibson.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the UK Government is committed to maintaining food safety standards and ensuring the UK has an effective food safety regulator. The Food Standards Agency is a science and evidence-based government department responsible for protecting public health and consumers' other interests. Any changes proposed to UK food safety rules once we leave the EU and are no longer subject to EU regulations would be subject to a rigorous risk assessment by the Food Standards Agency. Our absolute priority is to protect public health and consumers' other interests in relation to food, and we will continue to base this on the best scientific evidence available.
Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree with the Secretary of State for Trade, who's on the record as saying that he is, quote, relaxed about the diminution of food standards post-Brexit? Will the Secretary of State today distance himself from those remarks in this House?
Mr. Speaker, the Government is committed to maintaining food standards, and it will in future be a matter for the House of Commons to decide. And the bill that's coming before Parliament, I just remind the House, will bring EU law as it applies to the UK into UK law, so it continues to apply.
Jenny Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government knows that the UK relies on the EU for 25% of our food and that we grow just 15% of our own fruit and 55% of our own vegetables. Now, I know the Honourable Gentleman has nostalgia for decades past, but assuming the Government doesn't intend UK households' return to consuming spam and tin peaches, can he assure the House that he isn't considering imposing tariffs on EU food imports?
Mr. Speaker, this House has heard the word fantasy since it sat again, and of course the Honourable Lady has put before the House a fantastical proposal. We will ensure that the UK continues to enjoy the widest range of products in our shops.
Stevenson.
Number 8, please.
Thanks, Speaker. Both sides of the negotiation are clear we want to achieve the best possible outcome and the strongest possible partnership. To achieve this, we've said repeatedly that both sides must demonstrate dynamic and flexible approach to negotiations. As demonstrated by the papers published by this government, for instance, we've made it clear we stand ready to protect the voting rights of EU nationals living in the UK. There will be give and take as the negotiations progress. The destination is clear, a deep and special partnership that sees both parties emerge strong and prosperous, capable of projecting our shared values, leading in the world and demonstrating our resolve to protect the security of our citizens.
Stevens.
Given that a transition arrangement is likely to be required, and if the government is to be flexible, a simple solution to consider is an off-the-shelf arrangement with some modifications. Would the government therefore be willing to consider rejoining EFTA and then the EEA with suitable and appropriate amendments and modifications?
Well, as my honourable friend will understand, he heard me say earlier that we'd considered this in some detail prior to the Lancaster House speech, and come to the conclusion, one, that it doesn't actually meet the requirements that the British people voted for, but also that it's not as easy to negotiate as an alternative bespoke transition arrangement may be.
Mr. Hilary Benn. Mr. Speaker, now that the Secretary of State has accepted that there will need to be transitional arrangements, is it the government's policy that the UK will continue to make payments into the EU budget for that period, however long it lasts?
I think this must be the 20th time I've said to the right honourable gentleman that I'm not going to negotiate from this dispatch box, and he should know that. What I will say to him is this, is that transition arrangements, as we have described, or implementation period, if you like, or implementation phase, all the different words used for it, are there for one purpose, and that is to ensure, in his words, we want to avoid a cliff edge. It is not just true of us, it is not just the UK that's come to this conclusion, some time ago, as it turns out, but also the other members of the European Union. And one of the things we have been doing in the last 6-9 months is ensuring that they understand from their point of view precisely how valuable to them a transition arrangement would be.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's right that we meet our financial obligations when we leave the European Union, but past contributions we have made have funded vital infrastructure across Europe, including Eastern Europe, which will have long-term financial benefit for the European Union. Has this been discussed in negotiations and used to mitigate our final bill when those negotiations come together?
We have made very plain that the words used, that we expect to respect our international obligations, but also to have our rights respected too. And that point's been made very clear. I mean, one of the reasons that the last negotiating round was a little tenser perhaps than the previous one is because we were making very, very plain what we judged the legal basis to be. And that was not always comfortable.
Gable. What assurances can he give to financial services and other firms that are seriously concerned that they now face the cost and uncertainty of 3 successive rule books, the single market, post-single market transition and the post-transition agreement?
He as ever makes a good point, and this does mean that we want to ensure there's a single transition, not 2 different transitions in and out of a transition period. That is why, as the right honourable gentleman opposite quoted me as saying, I said that we want the transition arrangement to be as close as possible to the current circumstance. And you will remember too that when I responded to the right honourable gentleman, I said that there are 3 effective sets of criteria. 1, time for the government to accommodate. 2, time for other governments to accommodate. But importantly in his context, time after the decisions for financial services and other industries to do their own accommodation.
Fraser.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week, Michel Barnier said it wasn't fair that EU taxpayers should continue to pay for Britain's obligations. But the Secretary of State, is it fair that British taxpayers should continue to pay for the EU's obligations in circumstances where we may not be benefiting from subsidy schemes post-withdrawal?
Well, she raises a point that we've already raised, and I've already raised with Michel and the remainder of the team. At the moment, the union's negotiating team are taking the approach of stressing what they term legal responsibilities, and we are challenging them. When we get to the end of that, we'll make some decisions about political and moral responsibilities and also negotiating outcomes, and that's where the decision, I suspect, will be made.
Mr. Speaker, the government took flexibility to new heights over the summer, taking just under 3 weeks to jettison one of only 2 proposals set out in its customs arrangement paper on the basis that they represented blue sky thinking. Can the Secretary of State tell us how many more of the other proposals set out in the various future partnership papers are effectively just creative ideas that are unlikely to survive contact with reality?
I don't think the Honourable Gentleman was paying attention the day before yesterday. I said to him then that blue sky thinking, talking to an American audience, is a description of an imaginative approach.
Speaker, may I gently say to my right honourable friend that what everybody's trying to do, I had thought, was to try and form some form of consensus. And I think we all agree that we have a very, very short period of time to negotiate all manner of highly complex agreements, including a transitional period agreement. So may I suggest to him, rather than keep ruling things out, put everything back on the table and look at what we call Norway for now, which we could simply adopt as a transitional period until such time as we come to a final arrangement with the EU.
Well, the Honourable Lady can be as gentle with me as she likes. The simple truth is we went through the process of considering what the best negotiating strategy would be before the Lancaster House speech in some detail, and looked at who we'd have to negotiate with, where the compromise would have to be made, and what the gains would be. And we came to the conclusion that the route we're now taking, which is of discussing with member states initially and now with the union, a transition based on maintaining the important components of what we currently have, is the best way to do it.
Sarah James. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State and the Chancellor are working together to deliver the UK's departure from the European Union. Our future relationship with the EU, including on VAT, will be subject to negotiations. Any future decisions on VAT rates will be taken by the Chancellor as part of the normal budget process.
Mr. Speaker, our children go back to school this week. Our parents are still paying a fortune on branded school uniforms. Cutting VAT on uniforms for older children would save some £200 million, but can't currently be done under EU law. My constituents have asked me to ask the ministers to raise this whenever negotiations turn to VAT.
The Honourable Lady raises a very interesting point, which I know the Treasury bench has heard and which will be heard by the Chancellor, but I would just point out gently to her that VAT raised £120 billion in 2016 and provides essential funding for public services, including education.
Gregory Campbell. Mr. Speaker, does a minister like me look forward to the day when these protracted discussions are concluded and the Chancellor beyond this date will have the freedom and the liberty to set tax rates right across a whole range that we didn't have as members of the EU?
Mr. Speaker, that is exactly right.
J. Churchill.
Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll take 10 and 17 together. As we leave the European Union, the Government is committed to ensuring Britain remains a global hub for education, science and research. I was delighted to see this week that the universities of Oxford and Cambridge have been ranked as the top 2 universities in the world. To maintain our success, the Government is listening very carefully to the sector's views. This week, we published our discussion paper on science and innovation. As the UK leaves the EU, one of our core objectives is to continue to collaborate with European partners on major science, research and technology initiatives. The paper explores how the UK and the EU can achieve this objective together.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his answer. Indeed, we have some of the three of the world's top universities in this country. We also have a very vibrant life science indicated by the Life Science Industrial Strategy. It needs global talent and reassurance. Some have sought not to give academics and students that reassurance, and I know that from talking to people at the University of Suffolk and the University of Cambridge. So what reassurance can he give that this scaremongering isn't so, and give the university sector some assurance.
My honourable friend is rightly a champion for the excellent universities in her area. As the Prime Minister made clear in the EU exit white papers, one of our greatest strengths as a nation is the breadth and depth of our academic and scientific communities. Britain remains the second most popular destination in the world for academic study. We've already offered assurances to EU students starting a course in the 2018-19 academic year or before, and they'll continue to be eligible for home fee status, tuition fee loans and applicable maintenance support. I share my honourable friend's ambition for our university sector to continue to act as a magnet for talent from around the world.
Mr. Speaker, the University of Gloucestershire in my constituency admits students from across the world, including the EU, benefiting our local economy and community. What steps are being taken to amplify and underscore the message that the UK continues to warmly welcome overseas students to study here in Cheltenham and beyond?
Well, I would refer to my honourable friend to the answer I just gave. He's absolutely right, and I would add that the Home Secretary has asked the Migration Advisory Committee to examine student migration and report back next year. As she made clear in her commissioning letter, and as is echoed in our own science paper, international students enhance our universities, both financially and culturally, and often become important ambassadors for the United Kingdom in later life. So we will continue to welcome them long into the future.
Ms. Brandt.
The Prime Minister yesterday boasted about the number of Nobel Prize winners that this country has had, but the truth of the matter is that many of those were migrants to this country, and they started their life elsewhere in their world. They first came to this country to study in British universities. Shouldn't we be proclaiming that as part of our proud inheritance?
Yes. We are, and we will, and we can continue to do so.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister please reassure the University of Bristol and the University of the West of England that he values their collaboration with their EU counterparts and that he will prioritise doing everything he can to ensure that continued collaboration?
I would refer the Honourable Lady to the paper we published this week, which sets that out very clearly. We see huge advantage, both to the UK and the EU, in continuing that collaboration, and we look forward to getting into the discussion of this as we move towards talks on the future partnership.
Number 11, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 11 and 21 together. We do not need to be part of the EU to have strong protections for workers. As I explained earlier, the UK already goes beyond EU minimum standards, and the EU withdrawal bill will not change that. It will be in future for Parliament, and where appropriate, the devolved legislatures to decide on future changes to employment law. And of course, the government has committed not to roll back workers' rights, but to ensure we keep pace with the changing labour market.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, that's very interesting, because in 2012, the Trade Secretary wrote in the Financial Times, "To restore Britain's competitiveness, we must begin by deregulating the labour market. Political objections must be overridden. It is intellectually unsustainable to believe that workplace rights should remain untouchable."
That's right.
Isn't it the case you can't trust Tories with workers' rights?
Mr. Speaker, it's certainly not the case, and what I would say to him once again is that this government is committed not only to protecting workers' rights, but to ensuring that workers' rights keep pace with the changing labour market, which is something evidenced by the Taylor report, which the government is currently considering.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard very warm words about protecting workers' rights, which will of course be tested over time. But can ministers detail to the House today the precise mechanism they will use to work with trade unions, to work with employers, to make sure that upon Brexit, Britain doesn't become the low standards capital of Europe, and that we will maintain that status over time?
I would say to him is that this government wants to win the race to the top, Mr. Speaker. I think I can say that we want to ensure that this country is either at or heading towards the top of every index of human prosperity, well-being and happiness, and we shall see that we work towards that end.
Fernandez.
Speaker, I too join in congratulating my honourable friend on his appointment. Whether in relation to workers' rights or more generally, will he agree that had the British people wanted to be subject to EU law, they would have voted to remain in last year's referendum? And does he agree that the withdrawal bill actually restores powers to Parliament, and that a vote against it is only a vote to ensure that the UK automatically keeps pace with EU law with no say of its own?
Well, of course, my honourable friend makes a very important point for which I'm most grateful, and that is that an easy way to automatically keep pace with EU law, whatever it might be, would of course been to have remained in the European Union. But the public has not chosen to do that, and therefore in future Parliament will decide the law, and it will be for Parliament to scrutinise any proposed changes.
Michael Tomlinson.
I warmly welcome the Minister to his place. And does he agree with me that the withdrawal bill is not the great repeal bill, but it's the great continuity bill, and that workers' rights will not be undermined by this bill, and in fact they're already enhanced compared to the EU?
Yeah, of course my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think I should say that the original name of Great Repeal Bill was, I think, inspired by the greatness of its constitutional significance, and certainly not because of any changes it puts in place in relation to workers' rights, which, as we've said, will continue unchanged.
Bob Blackman.
12, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 12 and 14 together. I've remembered this time. We aim to get the right agreement for the United Kingdom and the European Union. Government officials are working at pace, and we have said repeatedly that both parties will need to demonstrate a dynamic and flexible approach to each negotiation round. Flexibility and creativity from both sides is needed, and we've already said we're willing to meet as frequently as required. We want to have reached an agreement about our future partnership by the end of March 2019. From that point, we believe a time-limited interim period will be in the mutual interest of the United Kingdom and the European Union. This will allow people and businesses in the United Kingdom and European Union to adjust to new arrangements.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his answer. Clearly, our future trade relations with the EU are vitally important, and it's good news there's a queue of trade deals potentially in the offing when we leave. But the key issue is that given our unique position with the EU, surely it is perfectly possible to conclude a trade agreement by the time we leave in March 2019.
Yes, she's exactly right. And of course, the bill we are debating later today is designed with exactly that in mind. The unique nature of the free trade agreement we are seeking to agree with the European Union is that we all start from exactly the same standards. And given what has been happening in the previous question, the same standards on labour law as well as the same standards on other matters. Actually, better standards on labour law than other areas. So he's exactly right. That's the key to getting a fast, effective and wealth-creating trade agreement.
Simon Clark.
Thank you, Speaker. People and businesses in Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland are confident about the opportunities that lie ahead after Brexit. Can the Secretary of State reassure my constituents that he will ignore some of the ill-judged rhetoric coming out of the Commission about teaching us a lesson and focus instead on securing a deal that works for our mutual benefit?
I think I should say, in the interest of maintaining amity across the negotiating table, that Mr Barnier did clarify that he didn't intend to say educate. He was meaning bring everybody up to speed on what the benefits, as he sees it, of the single market are. But both sides do want to achieve the best possible outcome and the strongest possible partnership for the future. And that's what we intend to do. It's in neither side's interest for there to be a cliff edge for businesses or a threat to stability. The UK and the EU will work together to agree provisions for an interim period that will allow people and businesses in both the UK and the EU to adjust in a smooth and orderly way to new arrangements. That will minimise disruption and give as much certainty as possible and meet the wishes of his constituents.
Or nowhere is the timetable for the leaving the EU more important to us in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Press reports today, Minister, indicate that there's a special relationship taking place and how we will work the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Can the Minister indicate to us some ideas what those discussions have been and what has happened so far?
Well, so far I can only talk at the moment to the discussions within the European Union or with the European Union negotiating group. We raised at the beginning, we were very keen that we started down this as quickly as possible. We understand, of course, that the conclusion we get will be dependent to some extent on all the other decisions on borders. So how much special arrangements we have to make will depend on how open the borders are generally. And we have made very good progress. The last round in particular, the Commission was concerned that continuing with the common travel area would impinge on European Union citizens' rights. We have persuaded them that's not true, and they have basically accepted our argument there and make
Mr Barry Chairman.
Mr Speaker, does the Secretary of State not realise that every time he gets this dispatch box and speaks, the uncertainty in the key areas of wealth creating in this country feel more and more uncertain about their future? We're hemorrhaging people, can't recruit people in the City of London and financial services, can't recruit people in universities, can't recruit them in manufacturing. For goodness sake, man, get on with the job.
Perhaps I'll organise a visit for him to see Mr Barnier himself. On all the areas he talked about, on the areas of universities. We've taken actions to underpin funding of universities. In industries, you've seen the Nissan arrangements. Financial services, we've talked to financial services about what we expect to happen, and we've talked in particular about implementation periods with them in mind, not just them, but them in mind in particular. There's plenty of action being taken to improve the certainty and improve the clarity of where we're going.
Finally, Charlie Offit.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Secretary of State on this issue that it's important to be robust on the timetable, but also robust in the face of Brussels' demands to us to send more money. We shouldn't be bullied or blackmailed, and we should be strong as a nation.
Well, I hear my honourable friend loud and clear. We've been very clear that the UK and the EU will have financial obligations to each other that will survive our exit from the EU. The Commission set out the EU position in July, and we have a duty to our taxpayers, as my right honourable friend has said, to interrogate that position rigorously. That is what we did line by line in the last round of negotiations.
No, we weren't on to another question. We were on the same question, but we had two different ministers appearing at the box. The honourable gentleman, the member for Dover, should feel very gratified that he had a dedicated minister to attend to his particular inquiry. It's something he can tell his grandchildren in years to come. Order. Topical questions. Mr. Martin Day.
Number one.
They're very funny. Since our last question time, the government has made important progress towards delivering the result of the European referendum and grasping the opportunities that Brexit can provide. In the negotiations with our European counterparts, we found important areas where we agree, for example, on pensions, on healthcare, on Northern Ireland, and we're now working on those areas where we do not. We provided more clarity by publishing papers on a range of issues. Finally, later today, we will debate the repeal bill, which gives effect to the result of the referendum while providing the legal certainty that will avoid unnecessary disruption. I believe it should command the support of all those who believe in securing a smooth and orderly exit from the European Union.
Day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leaving the EU single market and customs union would be an unprecedented act of self-harm to our economy, especially if the UK government fails to negotiate a trade agreement with the EU. Will the Secretary of State confirm that if he fails to reach a deal within the 2-year deadline, if the UK will remain a member of the EU under existing terms?
No, I will not. I mean, the vote of the British people was very clear. They wanted to leave the European Union. They wanted to take back control, both of borders and laws, and that would not be possible if we simply stayed inside the single market under current terms.
As my right honourable friend will be aware, EU legislation came into force in 1993 which gives protections to food from particular geographical areas, such as the Cornish pasty, the clotted cream and the Cornish sardine. Could I ask my right honourable friend if his department has had discussions with DEFRA about similar arrangements carrying on after we leave the EU?
I can assure my honourable friend that the government fully supports the UK's many traditional, world-class traditional food products, including those from Cornwall. We recognise the importance of protecting the name and status of high-quality UK food products, such as those currently registered under the Protected Food Name and Geographical Indication schemes. We're working closely with DEFRA on this important issue, and the government is also engaging directly with producers, actively considering how best to ensure traditional food products are protected once the UK has left the EU.
Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whenever I hear the Secretary of State explaining what will replace our current relationship within the EU, whether it's the single market, rights of EU nationals or whatever, it always sounds like a cut and paste, second best Heath Robinson version of events. I just wondered whether he ever, even for a moment, thinks it's possible he may be mistaken.
It would probably be a unique foray at this dispatch box for a minister to admit error. But let me say this to him. I have said at the beginning that this is a negotiation. It will take time, it will go in directions we don't necessarily expect, and there will be give and take in it. That's as close as I can get.
Steve Double.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Later today, this House will get to debate for the first time the EU withdrawal bill. As we know, a very important piece of legislation that provides certainty and a smooth exit for this country from the EU. But could the Secretary of State lay out for the House, and indeed the country, what the consequences would be of this bill not being passed? And does he agree with me that any member that seeks to block it passing is not acting in the national interest?
Well, I'm afraid it's precisely right. The purpose of the bill is to establish continuity for several reasons. Number one, as was raised by the honourable member over there, certainty for business. Number two, the ability to carry out the ability to carry out a free trade deal which will be unique in the world. And number three, to underpin all the rights and privileges that we have promised to our country down the years, including employment rights, consumer rights, environmental rights. All of those things are vital to national interest, so he's exactly right.
Simmons. Speaker, how should employers in my constituency that I visited in recent months today assess the risk of ending up with tariff or additional regulatory barriers for export to the single market when we leave the EU?
Mr. Speaker, those employers should have confidence that it is in everyone's interests, our interests and all of the nations of the European Union, to deliver tariff-free access between our markets, and I would say to them that they should have a great deal of confidence that we will therefore secure the deal.
Mrs. Kemi Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The purpose of the EU withdrawal bill is to provide continuity and a working statute book on the day that we leave. Will my right honourable friend be absolutely clear that a vote against this bill is a vote for chaos and a vote for uncertainty?
She's exactly right, and it allows me to reiterate one other point, and that is all of the talk on that side of the House has been about changing things in this bill. This bill is about maintaining continuity, about keeping in place the aims and purposes of all of the European law that we currently have and we will have the day after we leave.
Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The purpose of any transition arrangement is, as the Secretary of State said, to avoid a cliff edge and to give continuity and certainty to the UK economy. But the Chancellor and the Trade Secretary published an article last month saying that during any such period the UK would not be in the single market or the customs union. What is the purpose of a transition arrangement that undermines the very stability and continuity it's supposed to achieve?
He makes a good point. It would have been in his earlier question, I suspect, if he had the chance. The simple truth is, as I've said, we are starting from the aim of maintaining as much continuity as is necessary to anything that might change in the final settlement. So we will do that. Now, because we're not in the European Union at that point, legally not be in the European Union, we won't be formally members of the single market and the customs union. But we may well seek a customs agreement for that period and a similar arrangement on single market provisions. But we cannot make that decision ourselves. It's a negotiation to be carried out with the European Union.
Mr. David Jones.
Does my right honourable friend agree that the system of secondary legislation contemplated by the bill, which we will be debating later today, provides the best and most flexible means of ensuring that the United Kingdom is left with a coherent statute book when we leave the European Union? And does he not agree also that there will be general bemusement in this country that the opposition are seeking to oppose that?
Quite right.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I begin by paying tribute to my right honourable friend for all the work that he has done in the department. The quality of the work which I have inherited is a testament to the leadership which he provided in the department. I'm most grateful to him. But my right honourable friend has made a good point. Secondary legislation is a long-standing mechanism for making detailed changes to the law, with the scrutiny procedure for each instrument agreed by Parliament. Since their introduction, every government has used statutory instruments. Every Parliament has debated and approved statutory instruments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister earlier extolled the benefits of World Trade Organization should there be a no-deal scenario. But there's no automatic equivalent of the single aviation market or open skies. So what contingency is the Minister and his team making to protect our aviation industry?
The Honourable Lady makes a good point, and of course the Government is well aware of these issues, and we continue to develop our contingencies plans not only in those areas but right across government.
Alex Chaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Constituents of mine at world-beating companies like Spirax Sarco are the bedrock of that company's success. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the withdrawal bill must be the opportunity to cement employee rights, not erode them?
I do agree with him, and I think we've had a good canter around this issue today. I'm very grateful to him for giving me the opportunity to once again say that the government is committed to protecting workers' rights, to ensuring they keep pace with the changing labour market, and that nothing in the withdrawal bill will change that.
Well, I'm in an indulgent mood. Rachel Maskell.
Mr. Speaker,
Businesses are in desperate need of confidence. So when will the Secretary of State confirm that he will have the transition arrangements in place, because we would have left the European Union in just over 18 months, and they are making their plans now and need answers to that?
Yeah, good question.
Well, I'll say two things, Honourable Lady. Firstly, we will do that as soon as is feasible within the constraints of the negotiation. But secondly, if she's concerned about business confidence, the best way to guarantee stability is to vote for the bill this afternoon.
Davis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many farmers in Wales straddle the border with England. Can my right honourable friend outline how he's ensuring that the voice of cross-border communities are not ignored in discussions over Brexit and devolution?
My honourable friend makes a very good point, and we'd be happy to meet with him and his constituents to address this issue. It is very important, but of course this bill sets out a framework which protects common UK frameworks while we have the conversation with the devolved administrations as to where they are needed. I think that's a sensible approach to protect the interests of farmers and businesses across the UK.
Thank you. Order. Business question. Valerie Vaz.
Thank you,